I'll be going into really specifically the data gathering parts of Kumu. So how do you gather the data? How do you then import it into Kumu? We're not looking at decorations. We're not looking at the map. We're really looking at that first step. I know that this is always one of the most challenging parts of Kumu, especially if you don't have any data yet, or you don't really have an idea yet how you want to visualize. Getting the right data in the beginning can be challenging. So just know that our support team is always happy to help if you have any questions about that. So there's multiple ways to start gathering that data based on the type of map that you're creating. The very first option is the most simple one. It's when that data is in your head. For example, when you're creating a systems map, when you're looking at certain phenomenon and how all the factors within that system influence each other. A lot of time that information is already in your head, or it's discussed with your teammates, and you want to create a systems map. What I usually recommend in that case is to really start building out your Kumu map one by one. So when I'm looking at an empty project, it's really the easiest way is to simply click on this green plus button at the bottom and click add element. And then you simply start adding like this, and then you start adding other elements, and yeah, it's really building your map out like that. That's the first option. The second option is to export your data from another platform. Let's say that you already have a database somewhere, perhaps in a Salesforce or on LinkedIn, you already have your data, then exporting it to Excel is the easiest way because that's the most commonly used file. And then you can start restructuring that sheet for Kumu to understand. That's also something that I'll be going into later. How do you start restructuring so that Kumu understands it? It's very rare that a sheet is immediately structured in a way that Kumu understands. So usually it does require a little bit of tweaking before you can import it into Kumu. The third option is having a survey. So really requesting other people to fill out a survey to share their findings with you, and then gathering all that data in your Kumu map. That, of course, requires first the creation of the survey, really thinking upfront, what is the type of data that I need in order to tell my story? Or even taking it a step further, what is the story that I'm trying to tell? What is the subject that I'm trying to research? And what is the data that I need in order to be able to draw conclusions from that, or to create a data visualization that persuades others to see a system or a network in the way that I see it. So creating that survey takes a little bit of time. Of course, you have to send it out. You have to wait for responses. You have to remind people to respond. So that is usually a little bit of a more lengthy process to gather the data. And there's also the difference between having an ongoing survey, so knowing that new data is going to be coming in while you're already building out your Kumu map, opposed to having a one-time survey. So all the data is already in. You're not expecting any more data to be added afterwards. And you can really start working and visualizing the data set that you have at hand. And then the last option is crowdsourcing. And that's also a way to create a map that I find very interesting because, first of all, it's an ongoing project. So every time that new data comes in, it is automatically added to Kumu and automatically styled by the visualization rules that you've set. And secondly, it's awesome because you can really see how answers change maybe over time based on new information, based on changes in the system, based on a different worldview, different events in the world. So you can also use crowdsourcing. And there's different ways to import that data into Kumu. And there's also certain situations where you would, for example, prefer using Google Sheets, and other situations where you prefer using Excel, which I'll obviously go into. A little bit of an introduction, because our data model is it's relational. We're a relationship mapping tool. So we always like to look at the relationships between the data points as well. So the question is, how do we get all of that into Kumu before we can start visualizing it? Before you start building out your sheets or your Kumu map, it's important to know the different terms that we use or the different names that we have for certain entities on your Kumu map. So the first one is an element. You've seen them probably on our maps. The elements are the individual circle. And an element can be anything that you assign it to be. So it can be a person, organization, a project, an event, anything that you're interested in mapping. And usually it helps to also include that information in the profile so that people can easily see, okay, this element is a person or this element is an organization. You can even use icons to indicate that. The second thing is connections. Obviously, they're the lines between the elements and they represent the relationships, but connections also have their own profile. And there's a lot of information that you can add to the profiles of the connections. For example, you can indicate the strength of the connection, the nature of the connection. Is it getting better over time? Is it getting worse over time? You can then use that data to change the visualization as well. And a connection, again, can be anything. It can be a relationship. It can also be a type of connection, like how do these people know each other? Really a causal link between two elements. And then the labels are the names of each element of connections. And labels are the unique identifiers. So they really indicate to Kumu what the information belongs to in the profile. And every element must have a label. Not every connection must have a label, but you can use it because if you add a label to a connection, you'll see that you'll see that label on the map with the text. So if you like to have that info on your map, you think that adds to the story of the map, and you can add it. So yeah, like I said, you can really, you first start thinking about what am I mapping? Am I mapping people, organizations, factors? I usually just start with an Excel sheet and just start writing some stuff down. You can always change that, of course, afterwards. You'll be adding these as your element types, and I'll show you later a little bit what that looks like. But this is the most basic outline of what a spreadsheet is going to look like. So it's a label, it's a name, and it's a type. Then you can start adding more columns. So here we just have the label column and the type column. Any other information that you want to show up in the profile, you can put behind as a new column. So every time that you create a new column, that's a new field in a Kumu profile. So you can start thinking about what types of details do I want to add. If it's a person, perhaps an email address, perhaps a location, projects they're working on, and they're all converted to field. I'll show you a little bit later in an actual Kumu map what that will look like. But I think a lot of you have already seen that. You can see the fields, and you can have as many fields or as little fields as you would like. And the fields are the basic building blocks that will later inform your decorations. So I referred earlier to certain decoration rules, so that if new data is added to your map, it automatically takes on that visualization or that decoration rule, so that in the future, if you add more data, you don't have to worry about, oh, now I have to give it the same color as the rest of the data, because Kumu will automatically see, okay, if this element contains this field with this value, I'm going to make it yellow, for example. Another thing that's really important when you're looking at field is that you make sure that you clean up any data that has a typo or that is slightly misspelled or that is named differently, but it essentially is the same. Because what happens is if you create a control, and a control is a button or a drop down that you add to your map, that you can choose to filter your map. If there's two data points that are slightly different, you'll get duplicates. So I'll have two John Does. I'll have one spelled as D-O-E, last name, and the other as D-O. So make sure that you always clean up your data as you're going along. And it'll still happen that you're looking at a map and you see, hey, this data is duplicate, or this is not exactly what I want it to be. Then it's always easy to go back to that field, either in your sheet or in Kumu directly, and update it so that it's the same value across all profiles. If you create a field in one profile, it also automatically shows up in all the other profiles of all the other elements. However, fields that don't have any values are not shown to the viewer of the project. So the viewer of the project will really only see the information that's available, but you as an editor will see that there's an empty field, so a field without a value, simply because you're editing it and you maybe want to add more to it. So this is what your spreadsheet might look like a little bit later. So you have a label, a type, a location, and a project. And I can easily see that all of this information pertains to John Q, and this pertains to Jill Smith. Over here, you can see something that's called a pipe bar. And we use that in fields where you have multiple values. So if your elements can belong to multiple categories, you put them there. Usually, I'll go into that a little bit later, but usually this field is called tags. We have a default field that's called tags where you can put multiple values, but in this case, they wanted the field to be called project. So every time that you add a pipe bar to your data, it becomes a multiple value field. Then you start thinking about, okay, which connections do I want on my map and what information do I want the connections to show? And there's two different ways to create connections. And I'll show you a little bit later in real time what that looks like in a map. But the first way to do it is to have explicit from and to data. So you have a connection sheet and you indicate what elements the connection is coming from and where it's going to. It's quite manual. And I usually use that when there's not a lot of standardized data across my data set. The other option is to go for clustering. And I like that because clustering, first of all, it allows Kumu to create the connections automatically. But secondly, it also allows you to do that dynamically. So you can cluster on a map by maybe pressing a button, and you can undo it again by pressing that control again. So it adds an element of change to your map. Clustering is basically that Kumu creates connections based on the information in the profile. So if you have 5 people and they all work for Apple, if you click to cluster on organization, so on Apple, you'll automatically see Apple element in the middle with the 5 people connected around it. So here, a little bit of an overview of what that looks like in your data sheet. If you're using from and to, you'll have a connection sheet that clearly indicates the from and the to. And if it's done by clustering, then you're doing it based on the information. So for example, homelessness would be the center cluster, and then John and Jill are connected to it. Privacy would also be one element, and John is connected to it. If you already have an element in your map with the same name as the fields that you're clustering by, then Kumu will connect that automatically, because we don't want 2 elements that are called Apple. We just want Kumu to automatically understand, okay, I'm clustering by Apple, and I already have an element that's called Apple. So once you have your data structure, you build out the rest of your spreadsheet. There's two ways to do this, because some people find it easier to just get started in your spreadsheet. So they open their Excel or the Google Sheet and they start filling out information. Other people process information a little bit differently, and they find it easier to start visually and then export your data into an Excel sheet. So if I'm here, let's say that I create 3 or 4 elements that I think is what I want my final map to look like. Once I have those 3 or 4, I'll export here to Excel, and then Kumu will give me an overview, which will kind of look like this once there's data. But it'll give me the Excel sheet already, and then I can fill out the rest of it. So depending on what you find easier, to just dive into an empty sheet or dive into an empty visualization. Again, this really depends on how you process information, and there's no right or wrong way here. Okay, so again, in a later moment, I'll show you a great example of this, but generally you'll have one sheet for elements and you'll have another sheet for connections. If you're using that from and to data approach, you can have an element sheet without a connection sheet, and you can also have a connection sheet without an element sheet. Kumu will simply create an element for each from and each to. If it doesn't exist yet, Kumu will create it. Sometimes you'll have such a large data set that it might be too much to have all of it in one sheet. Then, of course, within the sheet, you can have multiple tabs, 1 tab for people, 1 tab for organizations. As soon as you import it, Kumu will merge all of that information in the different tabs. And we also recommend to always remove any blank rows or columns before you start importing, because sometimes without noticing it, people might still have data in some parts of the spreadsheet that they're not using, and then that creates an error when you're importing into Kumu. The tags are for situations where an element can belong to 1 or more categories. For example, a person can work on multiple projects within an organization, or an organization operates in multiple countries, or an event takes place in multiple years. You can use tags for that. Apart from the fact that it creates nice multiple value fields and automatically includes all of those categories in the decorations, it's very useful that if you hover over a tag in the profile, that it automatically showcases that information on the map. So the rest of the map fades away and it only highlights the elements that have that tag. And then finally, sometimes you have a binary matrix. Let's say that you have a relationship matrix where people are indicating who they have a relationship with or who they don't. Eventually, you'll want to include all of that information in one column that indicates the relationship or the partnerships. And again, you want to separate that with the pipe bar so that Kumu knows it's a multiple value field. A little bit of a pro and con of each import type. So the first import type is an Excel file. It's the most widely used file for data. Usually when you export from another platform, it'll be an Excel file. It's most used by organizations. Microsoft Office is on almost every computer in every organization around the world. And it allows you to pin elements in a specific place. So you can tell Kumu, I want this element to remain there every time that I refresh my Kumu map. The cons of using an Excel is that you need to re-import every time that new data comes in. So there's two ways to add data, because when you're using Excel, you can also add that data directly in Kumu. But when you're bulk editing, so you really want to edit information for 10 elements at the same time, it's usually easier to do that in Excel. So in that case, you'll have to export to Excel and then update the data and then re-import into Excel. So that usually creates a little bit of there's a risk of creating duplicates, which I'll show later how duplicates are created, but that's the downside of Excel. And then also if you import an Excel sheet and you make changes in Kumu, the Excel sheet that you originally used is no longer the master sheet. It no longer has the most updated information. So especially if you're working with the team, it's important to make sure that everyone knows, is the most recent information in Kumu or is the most recent information in the Excel sheet that we used for import. Then secondly, you have Google Sheets. Google Sheets is definitely my favorite. It allows for real-time updating of Kumu. So once your Google Sheet is connected to Kumu, every time you add new data, you simply refresh the Kumu page and it draws that new data in. So it's really great for that stage when you still have a lot of data iterations, data edits, updating. Maybe you're adding new field. Then it's easiest to just go into the Google Sheet and refresh the Kumu page. And the Google Sheet is always the one source of truth. So you can't edit in Kumu directly. You can only edit in Google Sheets. Google Sheets is also the best for crowdsourcing because, of course, it's really easy to share a Google Sheets link with others. Then they can simply fill out that information. And without you even having to be a part of it, that information now is also added to Kumu. The downside of using Google Sheets is that you can't pin elements in place. So Kumu always decides where the elements are placed. Not all organizations allow you to use Google Sheets, and it also requires a Gmail account. Then the last option that's not mentioned here is JSON. And I don't mention it here simply because it's used very little in the first step of importing data. JSON is more used for versioning. So let's say that I already have a Kumu project, then I can export it to a JSON file. And that is basically a backup of my entire project with all the decorations, the locations of the elements, any of the data that is in there. So if I use that JSON backup file and I import it into a completely new project, that restores the map that I had. So like I said, it's great for versioning. I usually, when I'm going to make large changes to either my old map or customer's map, I make sure that I export the JSON first so that if there's a mistake, I can always return to where I came from. That's mostly where JSON is being used. So I'm not going into that for this time, though if you have questions about that, you can, of course, always reach out to support. How to connect to a Google Sheets, I will show you that in real time, but it's really easy. And once that connection is established, it remains. And if there's any issues with the connection, Kumu will also indicate that. So it'll ask you to unlink. What's important to know about the Google Sheets is that if you unlink a Google Sheet from your Kumu map, that means that the data is being taken away. So you won't see anything in your Kumu map anymore. However, the visualization rules or the decorations that you put in there still remain. So if you reconnect that Google Sheet, it'll bring back the map as it was before. And sometimes users are surprised when suddenly they unlink the sheet and all their data is gone and they think the whole map is gone. That's not the case. It really is only the data source. And as soon as you take that away, it takes away the map, but it's also easy to bring it back again. Before I dive into some more specific examples, I would like to point out that you can find all of this information in our import guide. Very extensive. You can see here again the different types of data imports that we offer, what the pros and cons are. Know that you can also always exchange the data at any point. So let's say you started with Google Sheets, but now you want to switch into Excel. Then you can simply unlink the map with Google Sheets, export it to Excel, and then import it into Kumu. So you can really change that up at any time. And in the documentation, you also find some example data sets. here, these are all public and organized based on the template that was used. So if you click on any of these, you can find some data sets. And if you open them, you'll also get a link to the actual map that was created from that data set. And usually that provides a little bit more of a tangible example of what a map can look like and what the sheet was that was imported into that map to make it look like that. You can even use it as an example. So you take away all the values, but you keep the field and then import it into your own project. This file explains exactly how to structure your data for Kumu. As I said, I'm going into some examples now, but you can always come back here. So then specifically for each type of import, you can see how that is done. As I mentioned earlier, when creating a sheet, it's important to use certain fields so that Kumu understands it. The first one is label. In an element field, there should always be a column called label, so Kumu knows where to connect that information to. So all of this information is connected to Raymond Ackerman. Then these blue columns, these are the default fields, which you'll see in most sheets. The type is always a single value field, and the tag is always multiple value field. The description is a long text form, so you can really put a lot of information there regarding that element. And then any of the green columns behind those first initial columns, those are all customized. So here I can really choose whatever I want. Kumu automatically detects what type of field it is. So for example, here you're seeing net worth. So Kumu will make the type of this field numerical. Yeah, for example, this will automatically be made into a URL. You can also automatically have it have a certain currency. So Kumu does that upon import. Yeah, so here is the label at the top. Here's the element type. Here is the larger description, and these are the tags. Then here, connections. It's important to always have from and to always have to. If you're using a connections field, again, this one is empty, so you can also keep it empty. But as soon as you're putting data in here, it's important to have from and to have to. And these, the direction label type tags, are default fields. You don't have to fill them out, but if you do, they'll look a certain way in the profile. And again, these are just customized, so you can have as many as you want. Then this is one of the examples that we chose. In this case, it's a systems map. So it's a little bit different because we're not looking at people or organizations. We're really looking at factors in a system. So the label is a phenomenon, environmental cooperation. And then the description offers some more information about that. And of course, in the systems map, specifically, the connections are very important. So how do they influence each other? And you also want to make them directed. This is done automatically if you're working in Kumu. But if you're not working in Kumu, if you're working in the sheet, then it's important to add directed, because the direction will make sure that there's an arrow indicating that it's going to this element. A question that I often get is that people don't really know where to start. If, let's say that you're looking at an organization network, so you have people working for certain organizations, but you of course also have the organizations that certain people work for. So how do we want to visualize that? What I usually say is include all of the information in the profiles of all elements, because even if you're not going to need it, it's good that it's there, and it gives you more clarity on how you can later structure your visualization. But in this case, I would always say you have the label here, then first indicate what organization they work for. So now if I cluster my elements based on organization, again, Kumu will automatically create those connections. So it'll say, okay, Mark Malibu works for Apple, but Andrew Johnston also works for Apple, and vice versa. I'll have an element on my map, on my Kumu map, that is called Apple, the company. And if I click on their profile, I'll see all these people that work for them. So in this case, it's the employees, all these people that work for them. But I can also choose to cluster by employee so that, again, these connections are automatically created. So it's sometimes a little bit of a matrix in terms of information. And then you can decide, okay, do I want the center elements, like the important elements when someone opens a map? Do I want it to be organizations so that people first see the organizations and then can draw in the people that work for them? Or do I want to focus first on the people, who are they, and then draw in what organizations they work for? So yeah, you can go both ways. That's why I usually say just put in all the information and then start playing around with the Kumu map. So here, this is an example of some raw survey data. This is a one-on-one export from a certain tool that was used. I've randomized the names and you can't see any specific data information, but other than that, all this information was there in the survey. And of course, if you try to import this into Kumu directly, Kumu will say, I don't know what the label is. I don't know what the elements are supposed to be. So this is supposed to be converted, but let's say that more survey information is later going to be added to this data. Then I want this Google Sheet to automatically be able to pass on that data to Kumu. So what I usually do when there's a raw survey data, I create a second sheet and I will ignore this one. So every time you put ignore in front of a tab name, then Kumu will not look at that information. So I'll create a second one and I'll call that the element. And there, of course, I have my default labels. So I have type, organization, and then I'll start referring to the cells in the other tab. So I'll say this label is, start on the first one. Yep, like this. And then I simply drag that down. And then what I also want to do is drag that down for empty cells. So let's see where the data ends. Okay, there it ends. I want to continue this so that every time that new information is added after Peter, it automatically is brought into this sheet. And the same goes for these other types, right? You can refer to all of the data here, and then Kumu will understand it. Another thing that surveys often do is that they indicate relationships, especially when you're looking at a network, maybe referrals, maybe how people work together, a community. Then you're asking in your survey, who are you working with? The survey usually exports that information in this way. So there's in this case, the question was, what project are you working on? So you'll have project 1, project 2, project 3. You'll have category 1, category 2, category 3. But in Kumu, of course you want, because look, there's a lot of empty cells here. Of course you want all that information to go into one cell, like one field for each element that indicates what applies to them. So usually that is done again with tags. And what I usually do is all the way at the end, I would create one field that kind of is the summary of the information in all these columns. And then once I have that column that includes for that person on that row all the information, let's say MedTech business, then I'll refer to that cell in this other sheet. So here it will just say project, and then it might say, okay, this person is working on project 2, and they're also working on project 4, and now I can use that to decorate in my map. Usually consulting projects that I do that have survey data, it requires the most structuring upfront, but once it's set up, it should automatically work. The label is the unique identifier, which means that each label needs to be unique. If you're in a position where there's duplicates in your labels, there is a way to work around that, but it requires you to manually do that. Because, for example, here you can see that Mark Malibu exists twice. However, these are two different people from two different towns, and of course they have different information. So what Kumu does is it always picks the last information that it is given. So in this case, the element will be Mark Malibu, and it will just show Melbourne and just this email address, basically cannibalizing all of the information of the other Mark Malibu. In those cases, you simply create an ID field and you place it in front of the label column. So this is the only situation where label doesn't have to be in column A, but can be in column B, because now column A is going to be the unique identifier. And then you can fill out any ID that you want. It can be a specific employee ID, but it can also be as simple as just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, because now Kumu will know where to assign that information to. However, when I'm using IDs instead of labels, it's important that I also use the ID of the label when creating connections. So let me create a new tab real quick. Connections. Here I say from, here I say to. In this case, I'm not putting down Mark Malibu is connected to Nat Murphy, but I'll say 1 is connected to 3 and 2 is connected to 5, etc. Because now Kumu will know what those IDs stand for. And that's the same thing with connections. So let's say that there's 5 different connections that have 1 to 3. And the information in here, the type, let's say the nature of the relationship is different for each of them. So this one's good, this one's bad, this one's medium, etc. When Kumu is importing this information into the map, again, it will choose the last information. So it'll just say that this relationship between these two people is medium. Well, actually, there's different situations in which they have different relationships. So in that case, again, you add a column called ID so that Kumu knows what information you're referring to when creating these rows. So these specific ID numbers do not need to be the same as these ID numbers because they refer to different things. One is referring to elements and other is referring to connections. However, the IDs that are here, where you're referring to elements on the element sheet, still need to adhere to the elements that are used specifically here. So that's how you work around having duplicates in your data. And also, if what I usually do after I imported a Kumu sheet or a Google sheet into Kumu, I'll make sure that I count how many elements I have in here. Really easy, just quick drop down 100 people. And when I'm in my Kumu map, what you can do if you click A on your keyboard, you'll can automatically select everything and you'll see here how many elements and connections they are. Of course, this is a different map, so it's not the same number, but I want to make sure that it says 100 elements. Let's say it only says 95 elements, then I want to look at duplicate because probably there were some duplicates that Kumu merged. It never happens that Kumu just imports half the data and leaves the other half out. That doesn't happen. Kumu imports all the data, but if it's interpreted in a certain way, then it might merge data. And this is the same thing when you're exporting into Excel, making updates and then importing again. There's a higher risk of creating duplicates because you've changed information and Kumu is trying to connect that to the information that's already on the map. So what I usually do when I export it into Excel and there's new data, then I actually wipe everything that is already on the map and then import the new data just to really make sure that there's no duplicate. And when I say wipe data on the map, it's important to do that in 2 steps. So the first one is to select everything like I did just now and click on the trash icon here at the bottom, delete. And then the second step is to go to the project settings in the top left corner. I go to the trash, and in this case, it's empty. But if it says there's like 10 elements, then you can say destroy all. So you can really clear out your trash as well. Because how trash works is that let's say that I have an element called, again, John Doe, and I'm deleting John Doe. So it's in the trash now. But then I'm importing a sheet that again has John Doe on it. What Kumu does is connect that to the information that's in the trash. So it'll say, hey, I already had a John Doe. Why don't I just bring it back? Because that's easy. Then I don't have to create a new element. But if the information of John Doe and his profile has changed, then that's not helping me because I'm getting the old information while I'm trying to import new information. So that's why whenever I do a new import with Excel, I make sure that the trash is empty as well. So Kumu has a geotemplate where you'll see an actual map of the world or a certain region, and you can plot elements on top of that. And that is done based on a location. So it can be as simple as like the city or the town as it's done here. It can also be a country. It can even be a postal code. It can be a street name. Kumu is pretty good at mapping where it's supposed to be. However, you need to indicate that information on your sheet. So the most basic way to do that is to simply call this location. Any field that is called location has a valid value, like an actually existing country. And a geotemplate, Kumu will automatically place that. In some situations, you might have a field that is called zip code, and you have all the zip codes listed. In that case, you would have to tell Kumu, I don't have a location field. I'm using zip code for the location. So that is explained in our documentation, how to show that. I won't get into that right now, but just know that if you're using the geotemplate and you're using a specific location that is not named location, then make sure that you indicate that. But generally, if I would just keep this to location and I would import this, then the people that live in Brisbane would automatically be located in Brisbane and Melbourne, and it's all placed in the right way. Let's go into a little bit of troubleshooting. because sometimes Kumu won't understand the data. Okay, so let's go to the first error, which often happens. Here at the top, you can see that this is an Excel format. So this is basically an Excel sheet that's living on a Google Drive, but it's not actually a Google Sheet. So when I try to import this one into Kumu, what you do is you click on share in the top right corner. I copy the link here and import it into my sheet. Import, I'll say link map to private Google Sheet. It'll say unable to link map. So we have here in the import guide, we have some common import pitfalls, which I'll go through a few of them, but it's always good to, whenever your import is not working, to go through the common pitfalls. And this one you can actually see right here, importing an Excel file in Google Drive as a Google Sheet. So what I would need to do here is first click on File and save as Google Sheets. And as soon as this is a Google Sheet, I can import it into Kumu without a problem. Okay, so basically, if let's say that I wasn't using this first column with the name label, if it's something else that Kumu doesn't understand, I'll simply get the same error. So I'm not going to show you that again because it's pretty clear. But whenever you are importing data into Kumu and Kumu understands the structure, but there's parts of the data that it still doesn't understand, then there's a first step that Kumu does where it's basically verifying your data, and it'll tell you what it's not understanding so that you can go back to your original sheet and make changes to that. Sometimes Kumu will also, it'll give you a nudge indicating that you need to change something, but you don't actually have to. So for example, sometimes it'll say, hey, your connections don't have a label, but connections don't need to have a label. So in that case, you can say, I'm fine with that, keep going. But other times, you won't be able to continue without making any changes. So this is the importer review. This is the icon that I was referring to. So in this case, there were no connections found, but that's fine because I want to create connections with clustering. So I can still say import. If this little triangle is red, there's something that Kumu can't fix. And then you actually do have to go back to your sheet and fix the errors. What it also sometimes does, if there's a little red icon here, red triangle, that you can click on that one and it shows exactly the rows that are creating issues. So let's say sometimes there's one row that doesn't have a label while all the others do. Then you can quickly see here like, oh, hey, I forgot to put a label, and then still put it in your main sheet. Here in the top left corner, you also see wipe existing map data on import. That's kind of the same as what I was just explaining, where you first delete all your elements and then also delete it from the trash. So you can always do it like that as well. Just tick that box here. So then as soon as you save the imports, then your data is in here. Another common issue is that there's sheets that aren't being ignored. If I didn't have this ignore word here, then Kumu wouldn't be able to read it, and it'll let you know that it's not able to do that. Yeah, so those are the most common issues when importing data into Kumu. If you ever run across an example where you're simply not able to import your data, you don't know what's going on, of course, we're always happy to help. You can just send the Excel sheet or a link to the Google Sheets to our support@kumu.io, and then we're happy to help fix it for you. So that was all that I had in store for data import today. I would love to hear if there's anything that you feel like I forgot. And I'm also happy to dive into some more specific examples that any of you brought.